The courthouse stood tall against the evening sky as the sun began to set over the city. Judge Harris walked down the marble steps, his shoulders heavy after a long day settling disputes and delivering justice. 15 years on the bench had earned him deep respect throughout the legal community. His fair rulings and thoughtful approach to the law had made him something of a legend in legal circles. But now, as he loosened his tie and slipped it into his bag, he was no longer wearing his black robe, no longer sitting high above everyone else in the courtroom. Out here, on these streets, he was just another black man in America. The thought wasn't bitter, just a simple truth he had lived with his entire life. The judge checked his watch. His daughter was waiting at their favorite restaurant downtown, and he was already running late. He had promised to hear about her first semester at law school, following in his footsteps despite his gentle warnings about the challenges ahead. A smile crossed his tired face as he thought about her determination. Could cut through the park, he muttered to himself, looking at the path that wound through Riverfront Park. Save myself 10 minutes. Judge Harris zipped up his old university sweatshirt against the evening chill. In his casual clothes, jeans, sneakers, and the faded sweatshirt from his alma mater, nobody would guess he had spent the day making decisions that changed people's lives. The transformation from respected judge to ordinary citizen was complete. On the other side of the park, Officer Briggs sat in his patrol car, tapping his fingers angrily against the steering wheel. His supervisor had just chewed him out in front of the whole precinct for being too rough with a teenager he'd stopped yesterday. The memory of the humiliation made his blood boil all over again. 12 years on the force, and they treat me like some rookie, he growled, slamming his hand against the dashboard. Officer Briggs had a thick folder of complaints in his personnel file, mostly from minorities who claimed he had used excessive force or spoken to them disrespectfully. But somehow, those complaints never stuck. They were always dismissed as misunderstandings or exaggerations. His radio crackled to life. All units near Riverfront Park. Robbery reported at the convenience store on Pine Street. Suspect described as a black male in dark clothing heading toward the park. Officer Briggs immediately perked up. This was exactly what he needed, some action to burn off his anger. He grabbed the radio. Unit 347 responding. I'm at the north entrance now. The sky had darkened as Judge Harris made his way through the less traveled path of the park. The streetlights were spaced too far apart, leaving pools of darkness between them. He walked briskly, thinking about what advice he would give his daughter tonight. Law school was tough, and being a black woman in the legal profession would present its own set of challenges. He was so lost in thought that he didn't notice the patrol car pulling up at the path entrance behind him. Officer Briggs stepped out, his hand already resting on his weapon. The description was vague enough that any black man in the park would fit it, and the officer was in no mood to be careful or thorough tonight. The judge's phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from his daughter. "Where are you, Dad? Table's ready, and I'm starving." He smiled and typed a quick reply, completely unaware of the approaching officer whose day had gone badly, whose patience was thin, and whose prejudices ran deep. The park was mostly empty now, with just a few joggers heading home and a small group of law students sitting on a bench near the fountain, discussing their recent internship at the courthouse. The peaceful scene was about to shatter in a way that would change many lives forever. Judge Harris picked up his pace, the restaurant now just 10 minutes away. Behind him, Officer Briggs began to jog, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly across the path. The collision of these two worlds, justice and injustice, was only moments away. The radio on Officer Briggs' shoulder crackled with updates about the robbery suspect. According to dispatch, the man had taken cash from the register and pushed down an elderly clerk before running toward the park. This information only fueled Briggs' already burning anger. He squinted through the darkness, his flashlight beam cutting through the evening shadows until it landed on a figure walking quickly along the path ahead. "That's gotta be him," Briggs muttered to himself, picking up his pace. The man was wearing dark clothes and matched the vague description. The officer didn't bother calling for backup. He wanted this arrest for himself. Judge Harris felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Years of living as a black man in America had given him a sixth sense for trouble. He turned slightly and caught the beam of a flashlight bouncing behind him. Someone was following him. His first instinct was to walk faster, but his second, more measured response was to turn around and face whatever was coming. He'd never been one to run. Without warning, a harsh voice cut through the quiet of the park. "For easy. Police. Don't move." The judge stopped and slowly turned around, his hands instinctively rising to show they were empty. The flashlight beam hit his eyes directly, blinding him. Behind the light, Officer Briggs advanced quickly, his hand on his weapon. "Officer, what seems to be the problem?" Judge Harris asked calmly, using the same measured tone that had diffused tense situations in his courtroom countless times. "Shut up and get on the ground now." Briggs shouted, closing the distance between them. His voice echoed through the park, causing a few distant joggers to look over. The judge remained standing, though his hands stayed visible. "Officer, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. I'm Judge Harris from the Downtown District Court. I'm simply walking to meet my daughter for dinner." Officer Briggs wasn't listening. The man in front of him wasn't following commands, and that was all that mattered. The stress of the day, the humiliation from his supervisor, and his own deep-seated prejudices all swirled together into a toxic mix. "I said on the ground." Briggs grabbed the judge's shoulder roughly. "You think I don't know what you just did at that store?" "Store? Officer, I haven't been to any store. I've been in court all day. If you'll allow me to reach for my ID." "You're not reaching for anything," Briggs hissed, tightening his grip. The judge tried once more. "Officer, this is a mistake. I am a judge with thee." But Briggs had heard enough. Plain dressed up as a judge now. "You criminals get more creative every day." His face twisted with fury and something darker, a prejudice that saw only what it wanted to see. Before Judge Harris could respond, Officer Briggs' fist connected with his face. The impact was sudden and shocking. The judge, a man who commanded respect in one of the most powerful courtrooms in the city, fell backward onto the path. The taste of blood filled his mouth as he looked up at the officer standing over him. What neither man had noticed was the small group of law students sitting on a bench not 30 feet away. They had been discussing their recent internship at the courthouse when they heard the commotion. Now 3 phones were recording everything. "Oh my God," whispered one of the students. "That's Judge Harris. He presided over our mock trial last month." Another student was already dialing 911. "Hello. I need to report an officer assaulting a judge in Riverfront Park." On the ground, Judge Harris felt his judicial ID card slip from his pocket as he tried to sit up. The plastic card landed face up on the path between them, the courthouse logo and his photograph clearly visible in the beam of the dropped flashlight. Officer Briggs bent down and picked up the ID. His face, which had been contorted with rage just seconds before, now froze in an expression of dawning horror. He looked from the ID to the man on the ground, recognition slowly replacing anger. "You really are." Briggs' voice trailed off as the reality of what he had just done began to sink in. Judge Harris slowly got to his feet, maintaining the dignity that had carried him through decades of facing prejudice. Despite the blood trickling from his split lip, his voice was steady as he extended his hand. "My ID, please, officer." The weight of the plastic card in Briggs' hand felt suddenly as heavy as his entire career, which he now realized might be over in the next few minutes. The 3 law students couldn't believe what they were witnessing. They had spent the past semester learning about justice and the law, and now they were watching that system break down right in front of them. "Keep recording," whispered Taylor, the tallest of the 3. "Don't stop until this is over." Meanwhile, Officer Briggs stood frozen, the judge's ID card still in his trembling hand. The flashlight beam illuminated Judge Harris's face, which remained remarkably composed despite the blood dripping from his lip. "I believe I asked for my identification back, officer," Judge Harris said quietly, extending his hand once more. His calm voice carried across the path, somehow more powerful than if he had shouted. Briggs handed the ID back wordlessly, his mind racing through the consequences that were about to crash down on him. In 12 years on the force, he had roughed up plenty of people, especially those who matched descriptions. He had always gotten away with it. But this time was different. This time he had assaulted a judge. "Sir," Briggs began, but was cut off by the wail of approaching sirens. Someone had called for backup, though not the way Briggs would have wanted. Judge Harris dabbed at his bleeding lip with a handkerchief from his pocket. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Officer Briggs," he said, reading the nameplate on the uniform, "I suggest you prepare yourself. Things are about to get complicated." The law students had moved closer now, their phones still recording. One of them, Chen, had interned directly with Judge Harris and couldn't contain their shock anymore. "Judge Harris, are you okay? We saw everything," Chen called out, hurrying over while still maintaining enough distance to capture the scene on video. Officer Briggs turned to see the three young people with their phones pointed at him. The blood seemed to drain from his face as he realized that everything, his anger, his assumptions, his violence, had been recorded. "You know this man?" Briggs asked weakly, already knowing the answer. "Of course we do," replied Chen. "He's one of the most respected judges in the city. We just finished our internship program in his courthouse last week." The first police car pulled up to the park entrance, lights flashing, then another, and another. Word had spread quickly through dispatch about an officer assaulting a judge, and everyone was responding. Judge Harris straightened his sweatshirt and stood tall despite the pain in his jaw. Years of facing prejudice had taught him how to maintain his dignity in the face of injustice. He would not give anyone the satisfaction of seeing him broken. The first officer to reach them was Captain Reynolds, who took in the scene with a mixture of confusion and dread. His eyes moved from Officer Briggs to the bleeding judge, then to the students with their phones. "Judge Harris?" Captain Reynolds said, his voice filled with disbelief. "What in the world happened here?" Before the judge could answer, Chen stepped forward. "We have it all on video, Captain. Your officer assaulted Judge Harris without provocation. He didn't identify himself properly or follow procedure." Reynolds turned to Officer Briggs, who stood stiffly, unable to meet his superior's gaze. "Briggs, is this true?" "There was a robbery call," Briggs mumbled. Subject matched the description. Captain Reynolds looked back at Judge Harris, then at the students' phones, and finally at his officer. 25 years on the force had taught him to recognize when something was very, very wrong. And this was about as wrong as it could get. "I'll need those videos," Reynolds said to the students. "All of them." "Already sent them to the chief," replied Taylor. "And to the courthouse. And to Channel 7 News." The park, which had been mostly empty before, was now filling with officers, each one taking in the scene with shocked expressions. Judge Harris was well known and respected throughout the justice system. Many of these officers had testified in his courtroom. As if on cue, a black SUV screeched to a halt at the park entrance. The police commissioner stepped out, his face a mask of concern. He had been at a dinner when the call came through. One of his officers had assaulted Judge Harris, a man who had mentored him early in his career. Officer Briggs watched as the commissioner strode toward them, and he knew his career wasn't just over, it was about to become a cautionary tale that would be told for years to come. Judge Harris let out a long breath. His dinner with his daughter would have to wait. Tonight had become something else entirely, a moment that would test not just his own capacity for justice, but the system's as well. Within minutes, Riverfront Park had transformed from a quiet evening spot to what looked like a police convention. Patrol cars lined the entrance, their blue and red lights painting the trees in alternating colors. Officers gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed tones as they glanced toward the center of attention, Judge Harris and Officer Briggs. Police Commissioner Webb moved with purpose as he approached the scene. He had known Judge Harris for over 20 years, since the days when Webb was just a rookie officer and Harris was a promising young attorney. The sight of the judge with blood on his face made the commissioner's stomach turn. "Your Honor," Commissioner Webb said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "I can't begin to express." Judge Harris held up a hand. "Not here, Richard. Let's handle this properly." The commissioner nodded, then turned to face Officer Briggs. The look in Webb's eyes made Briggs take an involuntary step back. "Badge and gun," Webb said, his voice flat and cold. "Now." Officer Briggs had seen plenty of officers suspended before, but never like this, never on the spot, in front of everyone. Usually there was an investigation, paperwork, hearings, but he knew this case was different. The witnesses, the victim's identity, the video evidence, everything had aligned to make this a career-ending moment. With shaking hands, Briggs unclipped his badge and removed his service weapon. He held them out to the commissioner, who took them without a word. Am I under arrest? Briggs asked, his voice barely audible. That depends on whether Judge Harris wants to press charges, Commissioner Webb replied. But either way, you're done for tonight. He turned to Captain Reynolds. Get him out of here. Take him to the station and start the paperwork. As Captain Reynolds led a shell-shocked Briggs toward a waiting patrol car, the 3 law students approached Judge Harris. They had stopped recording, but still clutched their phones tightly, as if holding on to evidence that might somehow disappear. Judge Harris, said Chen, we've sent the videos to your court clerk and the district attorney's office. The judge nodded appreciatively. Thank you for your quick thinking, and for being witnesses to whatever this was. Taylor stepped forward. It was profiling, sir. Clear as day. We all saw it. The judge sighed, perhaps, but let's let the system work as it should. He turned to Commissioner Webb. Richard, I need to make a call. My daughter is waiting for me at La Bistro. She'll be worried. Commissioner Webb nodded and handed the judge his phone. As Judge Harris stepped away to make his call, news vans began arriving at the park entrance. Word had spread quickly, and the media was hungry for details about a judge being assaulted by a police officer. Commissioner, called out a reporter, hurrying toward them with a microphone extended. Can you confirm that one of your officers attacked Judge Harris? Webb held up his hands. We'll be issuing an official statement shortly. What I can say is that we're taking this incident extremely seriously. More reporters gathered, their cameras flashing as they captured images of the scene. Officer Briggs, now seated in the back of a patrol car, ducked his head to avoid being photographed. His mind raced with panicked thoughts about what would happen next. His mortgage, his reputation, his future, everything seemed to be crumbling around him. Meanwhile, Judge Harris ended his call and rejoined the group. Despite the chaos surrounding him, he maintained a calm demeanor that commanded respect from everyone present. My daughter will meet me at the hospital, he informed Commissioner Webb. I should probably get this checked out. He gestured to his swollen lip. I'll have an officer drive you, Webb replied quickly. Judge Harris shook his head. No need to pull resources. One of the court security officers is already on the way. He turned to the law students. Would you 3 be willing to provide formal statements? They nodded eagerly, still processing their unexpected role in the evening's events. As Judge Harris prepared to leave, he looked over at Officer Briggs in the patrol car. Their eyes met briefly, the judges steady and thoughtful, the officers filled with fear and regret. In that moment, both men seemed to understand that their lives had changed irrevocably in the span of just a few minutes. The judge broke the gaze first, turning away to greet his security officer who had just arrived. He had a long night ahead. Hospital visits, statements, and eventually, decisions about how justice would be served in a case where he was the victim rather than the arbiter. 3 days after the incident in the park, Judge Harris sat in his home office, reviewing documents spread across his desk. The bruise on his face had darkened to a deep purple, a constant reminder of that evening. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since the videos went viral, calls from reporters, civil rights attorneys, and colleagues expressing their outrage and support. He picked up the latest document, a formal letter from the district attorney announcing that Officer Briggs would face charges of assault, violation of civil rights, and misconduct in office. The judge set it down with a sigh. Though he was the victim, he found no satisfaction in watching another man's life fall apart, even if that man had struck him without cause. Dad. His daughter stood in the doorway, concern etched on her face. The news vans are back. There's at least 5 of them out front. Judge Harris nodded. They want a statement. They always want a statement. Are you going to give them one? He shook his head. Not today. Maybe not ever. This isn't about me making speeches. It's about the system working the way it should. He tapped the papers on his desk. And for that to happen properly, I need to step back. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Briggs sat alone in his apartment, the blinds drawn against the reporters who had been camped outside since the story broke. His phone lay silent. Former colleagues who had once laughed at his jokes and backed him up on calls now wanted nothing to do with him. The police union representative had made it clear that while they would provide him with legal counsel, they couldn't promise much beyond that. Briggs opened his laptop and winced at the headlines that filled his screen. Judge assaulted by officer in racially charged incident. Police department under fire after attack on respected judge. Officer's history of complaints revealed after park assault. That last one worried him the most. Internal Affairs had pulled his complete record, and reporters had somehow gotten hold of it. Every complaint that had been brushed aside, every incident report that had been softened, it was all coming out now. The picture they painted wasn't of a dedicated officer who made one mistake, but of a man with a pattern of behavior that should have raised red flags years ago. His phone finally buzzed, a text from his mother. "Call me when you can. We love you no matter what." Briggs put the phone down without responding. How could he explain to her what he had done? How a bad day and old prejudices had destroyed everything he'd worked for? At police headquarters, Commissioner Webb sat with the department's legal team and public relations director, preparing for a press conference that no one wanted to give. "We need to be transparent," Webb insisted. "No hiding behind ongoing investigation or personnel matter excuses." The public saw what happened. The PR director grimaced. "Being transparent means admitting we missed warning signs with Briggs. His file has at least 7 complaints that should have triggered a review." "Then that's what we'll admit," Webb replied firmly. "And we'll outline exactly how we're changing the system to make sure it doesn't happen again." The legal counsel cleared his throat. "There's more. We've been contacted by attorneys representing other individuals who claim Briggs treated them similarly. 3 cases so far, all involving minority citizens, all within the last 2 years." Commissioner Webb closed his eyes briefly. The damage was spreading beyond just one incident, one officer. This had the potential to force a long overdue reckoning within the department. Back in his courthouse office, Judge Harris had recused himself from any involvement in the case against Officer Briggs. He was meeting with Judge Patel, who would be overseeing the proceedings. "I want to be clear," Judge Harris said to his colleague. "I'm not pushing for any particular outcome here. Justice needs to be served fairly, without the appearance of revenge or special treatment." Judge Patel nodded. "I understand. But we can't ignore that this case has become a flashpoint. People are watching to see if the system treats police officers differently than ordinary citizens." "That's precisely why everything must be by the book," Judge Harris replied. "Officer Briggs deserves the same due process that anyone entering our courtrooms receives, no more, no less." As they spoke, protesters gathered outside the courthouse with signs demanding justice for all and end police impunity. The incident had touched a nerve in the community, bringing to the surface long-simmering tensions between law enforcement and minority neighborhoods. Judge Harris looked out his window at the growing crowd. What had begun as a simple walk through the park was becoming something much larger, a test case for whether true justice was possible, even when the system itself was under scrutiny. 2 weeks after the incident, the city was still buzzing with talk about what had happened in Riverfront Park. The videos had been viewed millions of times online, sparking heated discussions about police conduct, racial profiling, and accountability. On street corners, in coffee shops, and across dinner tables, people couldn't stop talking about the moment when Officer Briggs had struck Judge Harris. Downtown, hundreds of people gathered for what organizers called a community accountability rally. They carried signs with slogans like "Justice shouldn't hurt" and "No one is above the law." The crowd was diverse, young and old, all backgrounds, united in their call for change. Judge Harris watched the coverage from his living room, the television muted as he considered what was unfolding. His daughter sat beside him, taking notes for a paper she was writing on civil rights and law enforcement. "They want you to speak at the next rally," she said, looking up from her laptop. "Everyone says you'd be the perfect voice for this moment." The judge shook his head slowly. "I'm not interested in being a symbol or a rallying cry. What happened to me was wrong, but turning this into a spectacle won't fix the underlying problems." "Then what will?" she asked. Judge Harris leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "Real change. Not just firing one officer or making a public example of him. We need to address the culture that allowed him to act that way for years without consequences." Across town, Officer Briggs packed the last of his belongings into a cardboard box. The police department had officially terminated him yesterday, following an expedited internal review. His union representative had advised him that fighting the dismissal would be pointless given the video evidence and his history of complaints. As Briggs carried the box to his car, a neighbor who had once greeted him warmly every morning crossed to the other side of the street to avoid him. His face burned with shame. In just 2 weeks, he had gone from a respected officer with authority to a pariah in his own community. His phone buzzed with a text from his sister. "Mom's worried about you. Please call her back." Briggs set the box down and leaned against his car. How had everything fallen apart so completely? He thought back to that moment in the park, the anger that had clouded his judgment, the assumptions he had made based solely on the color of a man's skin. For years, he had told himself his actions were about public safety, not prejudice. Now, faced with the consequences, that lie was impossible to maintain. At City Hall, Commissioner Webb sat in a meeting with the mayor and community leaders, including Pastor Thompson from the city's largest black church and Dr. Lynn, who ran a neighborhood youth program. "This incident has opened old wounds," Pastor Thompson said, his deep voice filling the room. "But it's also created an opportunity. People are paying attention now. They want to see real change, not just press conferences and promises." Commissioner Webb nodded. "We've already implemented immediate actions. Officer Briggs has been terminated, and we're reviewing the files of any officer with multiple complaints." "That's reactive," Dr. Lynn pointed out. "What about prevention? Better training, community oversight, body cameras that can't be turned off?" The mayor, who had been quiet until now, looked at the commissioner. The budget implications of these changes would be significant. "And the cost of doing nothing?" Pastor Thompson asked. "Another incident, another viral video, more protests. That has a price too, doesn't it?" The meeting continued for hours as they hammered out the framework for reforms that went beyond just addressing one incident with one officer. Meanwhile, Judge Harris had made a decision. After days of reflection, he called District Attorney Powell. "I'd like to meet with Officer Briggs," the judge said when Powell answered. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Are you sure that's wise, Your Honor? The case is still pending." "I'm not looking to interfere with the legal process," Judge Harris explained. "But there's another kind of justice that courts can't provide. The kind that comes from understanding and making amends." 2 weeks after the incident, the city was still buzzing with talk about what had happened in Riverfront Park. The videos had been viewed millions of times online, sparking heated discussions about police conduct, racial profiling, and accountability. On street corners, in coffee shops, and across dinner tables, people couldn't stop talking about the moment when Officer Briggs had struck Judge Harris. Downtown, hundreds of people gathered for what organizers called a community accountability rally. They carried signs with slogans like "Justice shouldn't hurt" and "No one is above the law." The crowd was diverse, young and old, all backgrounds, united in their call for change. Judge Harris watched the coverage from his living room, the television muted as he considered what was unfolding. His daughter sat beside him, taking notes for a paper she was writing on civil rights and law enforcement. "They want you to speak at the next rally," she said, looking up from her laptop. "Everyone says you'd be the perfect voice for this moment." The judge shook his head slowly. "I'm not interested in being a symbol or a rallying cry. What happened to me was wrong, but turning this into a spectacle won't fix the underlying problems." "Then what will?" she asked. Judge Harris leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "Real change, not just firing one officer or making a public example of him. We need to address the culture that allowed him to act that way for years without consequences." Across town, Officer Briggs packed the last of his belongings into a cardboard box. The police department had officially terminated him yesterday following an expedited internal review. His union representative had advised him that fighting the dismissal would be pointless given the video evidence and his history of complaints. As Briggs carried the box to his car, a neighbor who had once greeted him warmly every morning crossed to the other side of the street to avoid him. His face burned with shame. In just 2 weeks, he had gone from a respected officer with authority to a pariah in his own community. His phone buzzed with a text from his sister. "Mom's worried about you. Please call her back." Briggs set the box down and leaned against his car. How had everything fallen apart so completely? He thought back to that moment in the park, the anger that had clouded his judgment, the assumptions he had made based solely on the color of a man's skin. For years, he had told himself his actions were about public safety, not prejudice. Now, faced with the consequences, that lie was impossible to maintain. At City Hall, Commissioner Webb sat in a meeting with the mayor and community leaders, including Pastor Thompson from the city's largest black church and Dr. Lynn, who ran a neighborhood youth program. "This incident has opened old wounds," Pastor Thompson said, his deep voice filling the room. "But it's also created an opportunity. People are paying attention now. They want to see real change, not just press conferences and promises." Commissioner Webb nodded. "We've already implemented immediate actions. Officer Briggs has been terminated, and we're reviewing the files of any officer with multiple complaints." "That's reactive," Dr. Lynn pointed out. "What about prevention? Better training, community oversight, body cameras that can't be turned off?" The mayor, who had been quiet until now, looked at the commissioner. The budget implications of these changes would be significant. "And the cost of doing nothing?" Pastor Thompson asked. "Another incident, another viral video, more protests? That has a price too, doesn't it?" The meeting continued for hours as they hammered out the framework for reforms that went beyond just addressing one incident with one officer. Meanwhile, Judge Harris had made a decision. After days of reflection, he called District Attorney Powell. "I'd like to meet with Officer Briggs," the judge said when Powell answered. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Are you sure that's wise, Your Honor? The case is still pending." "I'm not looking to interfere with the legal process," Judge Harris explained. "But there's another kind of justice that courts can't provide. The kind that comes from understanding and making amends." "What exactly are you proposing?" the DA asked cautiously. "A restorative justice approach alongside the traditional legal proceedings. I believe Officer Briggs needs to face consequences for his actions, but I also believe in rehabilitation and growth. If he's willing to truly examine the beliefs that led to his behavior, perhaps something positive can come from this situation." The DA was silent for a moment. "That's remarkably generous of you, considering what he did." Judge Harris touched his face, where the bruise had faded to a yellowish shadow. "This isn't about generosity, it's about breaking a cycle. Punishment alone won't change the system that created Officer Briggs. Education might." As he hung up the phone, Judge Harris looked out at the city skyline. The path forward wouldn't be easy for anyone involved, but for the first time since that night in the park, he felt a sense of purpose about what had happened. 6 months had passed since that fateful evening in Riverfront Park. The seasons had changed, summer giving way to fall, then winter, and now the first hints of spring. But the changes in the city ran much deeper than just the weather. In a community center classroom, former Officer Briggs sat facing a circle of people. His shoulders, once squared with authority, now carried a different weight, that of understanding what his actions had truly cost others. "When I put on that uniform," he said, his voice steady but humble, "I thought I was one of the good guys. I told myself the complaints against me were just people trying to avoid consequences for their actions. I never stopped to consider that maybe I was the one who needed to change." Across from him sat Judge Harris, listening intently. The program they were part of had been the judge's own creation, a restorative justice initiative designed specifically for law enforcement officers who had abused their power. Along with the criminal charges and civil penalties Briggs had faced, this program had been part of his sentencing. "The hardest part," Briggs continued, looking around the circle at the community members who had volunteered to participate, "wasn't losing my job or facing charges. It was realizing that I'd been carrying these prejudices for so long that I couldn't even see them anymore. They just felt like facts." When Briggs finished speaking, an older woman in the circle leaned forward. "My grandson is 12, she said. "He's a good boy, smart as a whip. But every time a police car drives by, he freezes up. That's what your facts did to him." Briggs nodded, accepting her words without defensiveness. 6 months ago, he might have argued or made excuses. Today, he simply listened. Meanwhile, across town, Commissioner Webb stood in the Police Academy training hall, watching as recruits went through a new simulation designed to challenge their assumptions and implicit biases. The department had undergone significant changes in the wake of the incident. Body cameras were now mandatory and couldn't be turned off during encounters. A civilian oversight board had been established, and the training program had been completely overhauled. Remember, the training officer told the recruits, Your first job is to assess the situation correctly. Your assumptions can be more dangerous than anything else you carry. Webb felt a presence beside him and turned to find Chief Thompson, recently promoted after the previous chief had resigned amid the scandal. "How's the new program working?" Webb asked. "Too soon to tell," Thompson replied honestly. "But the early signs are promising. Complaints are down 15% in just the first quarter, and officers are actually requesting the additional training instead of resisting it." Webb nodded satisfied. Real change took time, but the foundations were being built. Back at the community center, Judge Harris stood at the podium in the main hall, addressing an audience of legal professionals, city officials, and community members. "When I was assaulted that night," he began, "I had a choice to make. I could demand punishment alone, or I could work toward transformation. I chose the latter, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary." The judge's restorative justice program had become a model for other cities facing similar issues. The 3 law students who had witnessed the incident had all gone on to careers focused on civil rights reform, inspired by how Judge Harris had transformed a moment of injustice into a catalyst for change. "True justice isn't about vengeance," the judge continued. "It's about healing the individual who was harmed, healing the person who caused harm, and healing the community that surrounds them both." In the audience, former Officer Briggs listened attentively. His life had changed forever in those few seconds in the park, but not in the ways he had initially feared. Yes, he had lost his career in law enforcement. Yes, he had faced public humiliation and legal consequences. But he had also gained something unexpected, a clear vision of who he had been and who he could become. After the speech, Judge Harris found Briggs waiting near the exit. "Thank you," Briggs said simply, "not for forgiving me, but for making me face myself." The judge nodded. "The work isn't done, for any of us." "I know," Briggs replied, "but it started." Outside the community center, a small plaque had been installed in the garden. It didn't mention either man by name, but simply read, "From moments of injustice, justice can grow, if we have the courage to nurture it." The park where everything had begun was bustling with activity, children playing, joggers on the paths, families enjoying the first warm day of spring. Life had continued, as it always does. But beneath the surface of normal daily routines, something had shifted in the city. A conversation had started, changes had been made, and though progress was imperfect and ongoing, it was undeniably real.